This comes from Jason Vincent. Can we get an MWOD Pro episode on shin splints, please? The cause and ways to fix and prevent them. All right, shin splints. So let's talk about it. So when we actually have an athlete that has shin splints, this is absolutely kind of represents a simple biomechanical error. What we've basically done is created some kind of shear load or translational load or pulling load on the tissues of the shin that has caused, more importantly, the pain and swelling around that. So the issue is we've got to deal with that. We break it up into a couple categories in terms of understanding it. One is this anterior variety, and this is a classic shin splints. This is where we've got dogs, we've got girls, where I'm usually heel striking and the foot comes down and I get this really rapid deceleration. Hey Bear Star, can we hang out for a second please? This deceleration of the foot coming through under high speed, and it causes a lot of quick eccentric loading. Now, if you understand the mechanism for that, usually people are strong enough to buffer a little bit of that fast. Sometimes we'll see in the gym when we do a lot of standing broad jumps as part of a workout or some skill, athletes when they heel strike, they come down and they'll end up having some sore shins. When we see that happen, it's interesting because your calves are pretty robust and you walk around heel striking all day long. So what's happened then is that it's the magnitude of the load under that heel strike that's caused the problem. And usually, in my experience, it's for two reasons in the anterior variety. One is that we are fundamentally heel striking, which is a problem. We've got to stop that. And number two, that the athlete is missing ankle range of motion. So we're missing range of motion in the ankle. And I'll tell you, this is the place to start on this. Once you've disrupted the tissues, then we've got swelling that we're going to have to deal with and sort of to normalize the damaged and injured tissue site. That's a separate piece we'll talk about in a second. But we actually get to the bottom of it, assuming that you're not heel striking or you've just done some jumping or done some kind of unloading or run downhill. What's happening likely is that you're also missing some dorsiflexion. And so the capacity to actually bring your toe up and dorsiflex is an issue here. And not only is it dorsiflexion, but it's also the stiffness through the range. And that stiffness through that range can also contribute to this, because what ends up happening is that anterior tib, which is this muscle in the front here, tends to become very, very stiff in most people from the sitting, from the running. That's an issue, a tissue that they've never actually kind of got into. So we work on the missing ankle range of motion, and we do this drill all the time, is that when I work on the anterior tibialis, and just trying to smash those tissues out with balls, what we tend to find is we immediately improve dorsiflexion in the athlete because of the mechanical efficiency of the system. So when those anterior tibs are tight, what ends up happening is that they don't function very well. It's like a quad that's stiff or beef jerky, and then that stiffness means that tissue doesn't kind of handle load or transmit load very well. So we definitely go after anterior tib stiffness. That's a big deal. We've got to address the capsule, and we do that with all our kind of classic band distraction pieces. And then we also absolutely have to look at the other side of the joint. And so you can look at the heel cords as part of this system. And when we usually see an athlete who comes in with shin splints, okay, we'll talk about the healing in a second. Anterior tib is always stiff. We have capsular restriction and dorsiflexion, and the heel cords are very stiff. And so what we end up having is like a handbrake on your Ferrari. You're running the handbrake around, or running the car with the handbrake on. Literally, you're going to end up with a wheel that's smoking hot. So that's the mechanism for that. By the way, no kids heel strike. Heel striking is not natural. You can't heel strike barefoot. You've got to be claiming your feet, taking care of your feet, and that means learning how to run. So when we see swelling in the foot, it's the swelling, and usually it's the swelling in the interosseous membrane. So the membrane between the bone and the tissue sort of gets disrupted, and we get some swelling in there. When that happens, we recommend compression big time. You can compress that space. Even just wearing a compression sock can make a big difference. And the other thing is using some device like a Mark Pro, or even elevating to try to get your body to clear the fluid. A lot of times it's just a little swelling in that very small interstitial space that's causing a lot of the problem. We have to let the tissues heal. That can be anywhere between 3 and 13 days after a significant disruption. And the problem is most people are doing lots and lots of loading. Remember, if you're heel striking hard, you've taken 330 steps, 350 steps per side every 800 meters. And it's a lot. So that's sort of the mechanism for the anterior shin splint. Where we're living these days is the posterior shin splint. And what we're finding is that as athletes have come back into learning how to run correctly with the foot underneath the base of support, check out all of the CrossFit Endurance and Brian McKenzie's things for this stuff. But when we see that athletes are missing dorsiflexion and have stiff tissues when the foot comes down, or if we tend to overstride, as the foot comes down, the ankle translates through this load, through the loaded tendon of the posterior tibialis. So what ends up happening is that I have this posterior tib tendon load that's under large force, because remember that posterior tib runs behind and underneath to the bottom of the foot. And as my ankle translates through that load, because I'm either overstriking and it takes a long time for the foot to become neutral again, or I'm making an error where I'm running around my foot instead of just putting the foot down and immediately that foot becomes stable. If I swing around or open up with the foot when I strike, then I'm always going to have this translation through the joint. And that's the equivalent of putting a 2-to-1 mechanical advantage or a vector load right in the middle of the system. Loaded here, and then as that joint translates through, it creates large, basically doubles the forces at either end, and changes the vector pull. So right now, the tendon is lined up very well. Suddenly the ankle comes through. Now the tendon is pulling obliquely, and that tends to smoke the tissues behind the shin here. So what we tend to get is this light up of the posterior tib. Again, now we have swelling in the space. This tissue gets tight, and then we also get a lot of ugliness behind the shin because this is where the posterior tib wraps down and inserts in the bottom of the foot. So once again, we still have to deal with the inflamed or stiff tissues, and that posterior tib tissue is very, very stiff on people who tend to walk and stand like ducks. But this time we actually work upstream a little bit. We've got to clear anterior hip, the front anterior hip, front of the hip, and we work on the hip extension, because we know that if you're missing this position, all your errors are going to strike through because you can't pull the leg straight through. At the end of range, you end up dumping that torque and turn the foot out. We've got to work on the bottom of the foot. The bottom of the foot, which is the insertion for that business, we've got to clear up behind, and this is where the voodoo floss comes in great. So what we didn't talk about up here was voodoo flossing, but the voodoo floss large compression is a way of dealing with that tissue and also putting, and I probably use the Voodoo X here, so we'll add plus voodoo. And I'll put plus voodoo here. It's very, very, very painful. Bottom of the foot, posterior tib, posterior tibialis, and then also you've got to look at heel cords. Look, if something's not in the right place, we put it in the right place. Okay? That makes sense, but the ankle joint is pretty robust. If something's not moving, get it moving. These things happen because you are capable of generating huge amounts of force in ridiculous positions ad infinitum. You can do it basically forever until something punches through your consciousness. The problem is that there's some latency on some of the swelling, so you can disrupt the tissues, not know you're really having a problem unless you're running for 5 miles, until that tissue starts to swell, and it's that swelling that gets your attention. The issue here is that I've got to deal with the swelling with compression or some elevation. I've got to restore the slide. I think we have a bird in the house. I've got to restore the sliding surfaces inside the tissues themselves, and then I've got to make sure that the joint itself is moving. If you're experiencing one of these things, you have bad mechanics, and you need to ask your question why you're having bad mechanics. And it turns out that most people do not have the tissue tolerance to be able to manage some of the loads on this thing, and that's why because they're missing ankle range of motion, their heel cords are stiff, anterior tib is stiff, and you're freaks. So this is our take on this stuff. We don't ice these things out, we compress, and you gotta let them heal and calm down. If we can get rid of the swelling, then we see much, much better outcomes. We can see what's happening on if that swelling lingers, or you're an athlete who sits at a desk and you just basically shut your legs off. This continues to be a problem. Shin splints, preventable. You've got to have strong feet. I'm cruising around barefoot in the house. I live barefoot. My children live barefoot. I try to be flat all the time because I'm thinking, hey, I've got to be there. The last piece that I would put on this as an error is warm-up. Our idea is that you should have full ankle range of motion spontaneously all the time, but because of who we are and the way we work, chances are you haven't brought those tissues up to temperature or started to get them sliding again. They've been stiff, they've been short, you've been wearing shortened heel cords all day, and what's happening now is that you're going out and challenging that. How do you get prepped for this? Or how do you get prepped for running? Well, you probably start running, right? Go ahead and look on the CrossFit Endurance. Brian McKenzie has a ton of models on there about how to get prepped and treat the warm-up where you're getting prepped as skill. You don't just jump into your squat sets. You work on your squat, you put on the empty bar, you take lots of empty sets, kind of grooving the patterns, getting the tissues warmed up. This is a dead giveaway sometimes that your feet just weren't ready to take the load. So it could have been avoided if you had addressed a better warm-up protocol. We'll see you guys tomorrow.